everyone, this is Stephanie Wong, and we are back today with networking specialist Ryan Przybyl. You might recognize him from our popular series, Networking 101, 102, 3, 4, and 5, where he covered Google Cloud's networking fundamentals with me. And last time he discussed how enterprise networking in the cloud is changing from traditional to service-oriented networking, a mentality shift for companies and cloud providers alike. And today we're covering how you can approach these changes and how Google Cloud specifically is addressing it and evolving with it. So before I start, I just want to mention, please comment below with questions, anything that we didn't get to last time. We are going to take a look at all of them. So definitely chat us and make sure that we can get to all of your questions. And for Ryan, to kick it right off, last time we talked about customers moving newer applications to the cloud and adopting service-oriented networking functionalities. So what do we provide as a stepping stone to enable enterprises who do use this traditional networking model?
Yeah, so I think Google is continuing to evolve our networking layer constructs. And I think all the cloud providers are doing this, right? And there's a lot of interesting internal conversations that I have with, engineers and product managers. I think everybody wants to work on the newest, latest, greatest things, right? And I'm constantly having to remind people that, there's a lot of fundamental stuff that we still need to work on as well. And maybe it's not the bright, shiny object, sexy thing to work on, but it's very critical for an enterprise, right? The more products and tools I can offer to sort of replicate your data center environment, which I sort of touched on last time, right? The more of those features I have, the more you can kind of pick and choose how you want to migrate, right? And what stepping stones you want to integrate. So you could have sort of like, okay, I'm going to move like this, and it's going to be literally a mirror image of my data center, right? And that assumes we had every networking product working every way you wanted it. You could do that. And then say, after I migrate to 10,000 applications, I'm going to make this change. And that's going to be my first stepping stone, right? The reality is, none of the cloud providers are completely there yet, right? Like we're having to literally re-engineer, 50 years of telecom into this cloud environment, right? Into the SDN. And, we're building all sorts of products and features that maybe have been very traditional for many, many years. But the bottom line is because we're building all these constructs, not necessarily from scratch, but we have to build all those features in, right? So like as an example, if you do a lot of routing with say communities and local pref and things like that at a routing layer, that's not something you could just bring into Google Cloud today, right? And use like a cloud router to do that. So that's like a point, like a function that isn't there that we need to continue to evolve. And again, all cloud providers are sort of in this boat. So in terms of those stepping stones, like I want to be able to continue to push Google and continue to build all of those tools that give the customer those stepping stones to say, I want to make these little incremental changes. The worst thing I have to do is like get with a customer and say, you can't do it. It has to be done this way. Because as I mentioned before, depending on what that particular way is, that could be a very big, chunk to bite off and be very difficult for the customer to adopt. Okay. So I'm always cognizant of that. And that's why, again, coming with a very traditional networking background, I'm always pushing us to keep developing those small stepping stones that customers can place to help them make that change. Now, a good example of like, let's say you were a traditional, network infrastructure sort of setup, and you wanted to say, start introducing some of these service sort of constructs. So I talked about PSC, Private Service Connect before. You could say, I want to use PSC to front end a particular Google API, and I just want to try it out that way. Or maybe you're using a cloud service. Maybe you're using something like Snowflake or something else that's really designed and kind of grew up in the cloud. And that would be a great place to like introduce some of these service sort of layer constructs into the model where you're not trying to like all of a sudden change everything, but you're just saying, I want to front maybe the Google APIs with a PSC endpoint. Tons of customers use Google APIs every day to do all sorts of things. That would be a great sort of like stepping stone. And then you get to sort of understand like, how does PSC work?
Just talking about for the people who do want visibility and control over building something like a NAT gateway and handling routing, what's been the response from providers like Google Cloud?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to like, there's still things that we are building. So like when you take PSC and it's being a managed service where we're handling NATing and we're handling routing under the covers, right? Let's take the NAT case, right? Like we understand that there's still product development work that we have to do on NAT functionality, right? And we are constantly evolving. So this is kind of what I'm referring to when we talk about, customers aren't always, comfortable with losing that visibility, but it's incumbent on your cloud provider to understand where you're coming from and why you're coming from there and continue to evolve their networking technology. Now, that being said, NATing is nothing new, right? It is a very old technology. It's been around for a long time. It's just certain levels of functionality we have yet to develop, right? So I think this is a key point. We talked a little bit about, I think most people agree, the service networking model is the way forward, right? If you look 20 years from now, right, everybody's going to be using sort of that paradigm, I think, okay? And it's easy to continue to say, that's the cutting edge stuff. Let's go and develop that stuff, right? Versus something that, say, like NATing, that is an old technology. One approach is, let the customers manage it. They can put their own NAT gateways in there. They can do things themselves. And there are ways to do this stuff. But we want to continue to enable customers with easy to use, easy to consume services, right? So like I said, we're doing more work on the NAT front to expand our capabilities. So a customer who's maybe not entirely comfortable using PSC because they lose some visibility things, we're giving them more and more of that network layer functionality so that they can build, again, kind of like what they have in the data center to replicate it as much as possible, to give them that comfort factor of getting into cloud. And then once they're in cloud, start to look at some of these other technologies.
Right. And I do know that we have some visibility and intelligence options. For example, we just came out in the last couple of years, Network Intelligence Center, which gives you visibility for things like running connectivity tests between endpoints or monitoring your performance through dashboard or looking at your topology from a visual standpoint. And so this seems like it's more in the realm of a service-oriented model, but do you consider this an overlapping area where we can start to build bridges and allow traditional networking architects and engineers understand how to get visibility in a service-oriented environment?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I've been in the space for 20 years and I've touched, I don't know how many thousands of networks, but they're all built differently, right? Nobody builds, two networks are, kind of like a fingerprint. They're all slightly different, right? And it's our job to sort of understand that. But one fundamental is being able to troubleshoot them when they break, okay? And as I mentioned earlier, when you move into the cloud and you move into sort of our SDN and how things have been built under the hood, right, that isn't always, easily understandable by customers, right? So tools like Network Intelligence Center are designed to help sort of bridge that gap, okay? You may have a very traditional way of troubleshooting your network and saying okay, I can see all these paths, but things like a trace route, for example, which is a very common troubleshooting tool, right? It doesn't always give you the information that maybe it would in your data center where you can see okay, I'm hopping here, I'm hopping here, I'm hopping to the firewall, I'm going through the firewall, I'm hopping to another router, right? You don't typically get that kind of information. So just as an example, when you build a VM, we program route tables onto that VM. We program firewall rules on that VM. So if traffic isn't getting to that VM, is it because it can't route to that VM? Is it because there's a firewall rule that's blocking the traffic, right? So, again, from a traditional networking standpoint of view, you might use traceroute and say, oh, I see it went from the original server, it went to the router, from the router, it went to the firewall, and then I see it stop, right? Oh, well, it's the firewall that's blocking it. But what do you do when the firewall, the routes, all this stuff live on the VM? What is it that's actually causing the packet not to get there? So that's where things like Network Intelligence Center, they help bridge that gap.
Right. And I think it's key to note that there are tools and modes of thinking that still are applicable in this case. You can always run a trace route, even if your applications live in the cloud. And we also have tools in logging and monitoring like Cloud Trace. So I think it's sort of just understanding where to map certain concepts and how they translate into the cloud. But do you find most companies in general who operate in a network-centric model more or less eager to adopt this service-oriented model of networking?
Eager to adopt, like I said, I think depending on who you talk to, it might be a yes, it might be a no. Again, having a traditional network engineering background, it's a little bit scary when you start talking about, we're going to put a whole bunch of sidecar envoy proxies in there, and we're going to start talking about service meshes and service discovery, and we're going to start abstracting the network where we're really just, this service needs to connect to another service. We'll just push it to the envoy proxy and let the envoy proxy figure out how to handle this, right? So again, you're kind of abstracting the network away. As a networking guy, it's kind of like, well, are you abstracting my job away? This is what I've been dealing with for 20 years, right? And the answer is ultimately no. The network still exists. But it's a fundamental like shift, like a mental shift that you're having to make to sort of adapt with the time. So I think most people see like that is the path forward. But on one level, it seems kind of simple. You talk about like, oh, we're going to talk about service networking. We're talking about service meshes and service discoveries. And, even if you decide to break a monolithic app down into, microservice and things like that, it's easy to whiteboard this stuff out sometimes, right? Implementing it is a total another ballgame. If you want to see a really good video on this, if you go to the Envoy Proxy website, Matt Klein over at Lyft did sort of a history of Lyft and sort of how they integrated a lot of these level constructs into Lyft's environment. And it is a great sort of trying to get your getting your head around, a monolithic app, being broken into these, smaller services, and really what service networking really looks like and all the complexities around it. It's probably an hour-long watch, but I thought Matt did a really good job of describing like, hey, this seems easy on one hand, but in reality, it is a lot more complex. So to your point, this is why, these very large traditional enterprises, I think they see that path forward, but it's super scary when you start watching videos like that and you start dissecting this and say, I got to move 5,000 applications. And, if somebody wants to use this model, there's all these complexity that's going to get added to things and things I have to solve for. And oh, by the way, this is a way of thinking that I maybe never had to have in the past. So I think a lot of people see the vision, but again, implementing it is a total different ballgame. And that's where it becomes incumbent on having all those networking constructs to make it easy and path of least resistance to move into the cloud for a large enterprise. And I call this a grow with Google model, right? So while we have a lot of people that are, hyped on the service architecture model, it's kind of like the Grand Canyon, right? I can't expect somebody to leap across the Grand Canyon, right? I have to get them into the environment, and then I have to build these small stepping stones, right? I have to start introducing things like PSC, kind of like I mentioned, like using it to maybe front end Google APIs. Introduce it as a small stepping stone so that they can take these small steps to get across the Grand Canyon and aren't trying to make this fundamental leap from here's where I am today to here's where Google, sees us in the future.
But I mean, you're right. It's growing with Google. And I think we're continuously investing in providing those stepping stones that better translate and map to traditional networking models. Meanwhile, customers are also becoming more accustomed to adopting and taking on the approach of service-oriented models with the emergence of their newer applications that are cloud native.
Yeah, and kind of what I mentioned in the first video too, right? Like, there's the technology aspect of it, right? How to implement the technology, but then there's the how does the organization operate, right? I can build a lot of things, right? And Google, and we build tons of different network architectures with our customers. But at some point, I have to hand it over to an operations team. And the only thing I can ever guarantee about any network that I build is it will break at some point, right? It's like the one guarantee I'm willing to make. So it's not just a matter of like, take the technology and implement the technology, but it's also, like I was mentioning in the previous conversation, thinking about how you operationalize this stuff, right? Like what sort of operational impacts does it have to your existing monitoring suite, the existing tools you use, the existing processes, the existing mindset that a network engineer goes through to troubleshoot a problem, right? If you're starting to abstract more of the network away, you've got to think about like, well, how do I troubleshoot problems when the service doesn't work, right? If I don't have visibility to everything and maybe I'm using some Google tools that are new to me, it's going to be a little bit of a cultural shift, right?
Yeah. And you were just talking about having to overcome technical debt. And we're trying to provide a path of least resistance for our customers. But what does that begin to look like? What is Google Cloud doing in this space to provide an easier path or a lower barrier to entry?
So again, I think this goes back to having the right tools in the toolbox, right? And to me, tools are features and capabilities at a networking layer, right? So the path of least resistance, right, ideally is I'm going to take my data center and I'm going to forklift it in the entire same way that it operates today in Google Cloud with zero changes, right? That would be the ideal, I guess, path of least resistance because literally nothing changes, right? The bottom line is that's basically impossible. You can't do it for a number of reasons, okay? So when we're having those conversations with customers, we talk about like what are the stepping stones that a particular customer can adopt and that they can get their head around using. Even just the concept of like our basic level VPC, right? Like if you're talking about a data center is a physical building and a physical location, okay? And your network, when you start to talk about like the local area network or in that data center, it's, maybe it's in Dallas, Texas as an example. And then you move into cloud and you're like, well, now I have this construct of a VPC, which is kind of like my data center network, but it can be a global construct. Okay, that's interesting. Well, how do I set up routing in there? How do I do all this stuff? Oh, we tell people all the time, like, you don't have to do a lot because our Andromeda SDN will take care of a lot of things, right? It's different from a lot of our competitors where you're having to build a lot of network infrastructure like VPNs or the things to connect, region A to region B. That starts to look in some ways like, connecting two data centers. I got to build network between them. Then you come to Google and it's like, well, I can run stuff in Europe and I can run stuff in APAC and it can seamlessly talk together. Yeah. And you don't have to build any network. Sure. Like, we take care of all that for you. Again, we've kind of abstracted it under the hood. So like, that's just an example of, that in itself is a fundamental difference, right? Like, you could build a VPC that exists only in one region and kind of make it look and feel like a data center. But generally speaking, I would advise a customer not to do that, right? So that would be one of those sort of stepping stones. Let's start thinking about your network as this global construct that exists in a different way than an individual data center does. So the more sort of tools I have in the toolbox, and again, when I say tools, I'm talking about like product features, to say, okay, you do things this way today, and changing that piece of your environment is too difficult for you to do. Okay, I want to be able to let you move that over apples to apples. But this other piece of the environment, maybe we can move from apples to oranges. And this other piece, I can more drastically change from like apples to cherries, right? That's what I do every day, right? I'm talking to customers and figuring out, like, how do we move from here to here, but get some of the advantages of cloud, right? Even if we're talking about just network-centric things, right? We're not talking about any of the service-oriented model. Let's talk about what your network looks like 2 years out. What do you want it to look like? And how do we help you take it from where it is today to where you want it to be in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years?
Yeah, and I think that eases the concern when you are looking at it from the perspective of being a partner over the span of years, as opposed to we're asking you to make an entire shift of model and thinking in the span of 6 months. But rather, how can we get you to this new world of service orientation over the span of 2 to 3 years, which is more, I think, reasonable for people to accept. And then you're also talking, I think you've also mentioned that you have a viewpoint that Google Cloud and other providers should be providing more traditional networking tools, or at least the ability to translate what you've been doing in your current environment into the cloud. So when you say these things, do you mean offer more customization, the ability to control more of the routing layers, things like that? Or is it more just about tools in the toolbox?
Yeah, I mean, again, when I say tools, I'm talking about like product features and things like that, right? So, one I mentioned earlier with routing is, let's say you do a whole bunch with, BGP filtering policies and things like that, or you're using local pref in a certain way to drive routing. That's not something we offer today with our cloud router. It's something I'm talking to the cloud router team about and saying, like, hey, what can we do to sort of offer, more and more of these basic level features that customers are using within their data center to manipulate routing. So those are the type of things that I'm talking about with the teams. And when I say, like, offer these, these tools or these products, the more of those I have in the toolbox, and I use that term loosely, that toolbox, right? It allows us, again, to create that apples to apples sort of scenario. Now, the one thing that's different that I do want to sort of talk about too is, when you build a data center, right, it's typically a very capital intensive thing, right? You're going out there and you're buying all this equipment, and it's what we call a heavy CapEx model, right? You go buy all these routers and switches, and they have a whole list of features, and you put them in the data center and you use them for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever, right? And then what happens is, once they've lived their life, you have another big capital spend and you upgrade that router and you get a whole bunch more feature functionality out of it potentially, okay? This is kind of the mindset that people have done, right? I built the data center day one and it's going to live that way for the next 5 years or 10 years. I'm going to make small incremental changes, but I'm not going to make any fundamental changes because I spent all this capital over here. Cloud flips that model on its head, right? You're not buying routers anymore. It is a very OpEx driven model, right? So you're paying for these services month over month. You're not saying, I have this huge bucket of cash I'm spending here, and then 10 years down the road, I'm having another huge bucket of cash. So why is that important? Well, in this OpEx model where you're buying more managed services, like I was saying, we're constantly introducing new features and new tools in the toolbox to change the architecture and to change the way that you can do things. So if you have this mentality of, I build it this way, and then it's going to live for 5 years and I'm going to change it, you're not getting the full advantage out of cloud, right? The whole point of cloud in some ways is to be able to make changes more periodically. Even if, again, go back to the customer who yelled at me and said, it's very difficult for us to do. The more you can adopt that mindset, the more you can capitalize on the evolution that cloud is making, right? Like, if we're launching new features, and we're giving you new capabilities, you want to continuously be integrating them, not thinking like you do in a traditional data center model where I got this model, I'm going to change it in 5 years. It's like, I tell customers every 6 months, you should be looking at like, what do we need to change in the architecture? How do we roll this architecture forward? But if you're taking those incremental changes every 6 months, it's much easier to get to like your 2-year vision, your 5-year vision, versus maybe that traditional mentality. So again, I think people need to think about cloud differently just from that standpoint, right? It's an OpEx model. You're not spending CapEx, which should make it easier for you to be integrating these changes over the course of time versus making these very large step function changes to the way things are running in the cloud environment.
Yeah, I think you having that background in traditional networking helps you understand where a lot of these customers are coming from. And it is about crawl, walk, and run. But I do see that some customers are probably going to think, okay, well, I don't really have a project that would require me to be in the cloud just yet because everything's operating on premise. But perhaps there is a team that is the cloud disruptor at the company who might have a test project or a test dev environment that they want to start operating in the cloud. And so thus, I think that relationship between network and the developers or other teams would be important in that case to actually identify these use cases where you can start adopting these models in the cloud. But I do want to zoom out just a little bit and talk about the future of where this is all heading. Where do you see cloud networking heading? I see that we're getting to a point where things are converging with networking and service-oriented models, but what do you think is going to be the future for cloud and for Google Cloud in this space?
So it's definitely, as we've been kind of orbiting around this service networking model, right? That is the future, hands down. Like I don't see it being anything other than this. Okay. And, again, just look at how Google operates, right? We operate services, even though, like I talked about earlier, we run a very complex network. At the end of the day, we don't run a network to run the network. We run services. The network is just part of it, right? And you look at, so as an example, you look at how our SRE teams operate, right? We have SRE teams that operate in kind of these verticals, right? So they operate this service. This service has, networking as part of it, but there's a lot of other components, right? And that's how our SRE teams operate. Now, we have a networking SRE team that kind of, goes horizontally across things, right? And you're always going to have some level of expertise there. But I see us as an operating company, right, who are operating services. We're building the structure around these services themselves. And then there's the stuff that's kind of wrapped around them to support those services. And that includes networking, right? And all of the constructs that exist in networking, right? It will continue to evolve to be more of this service-oriented construct, whether we like it or not. And like you said, I can empathize with customers because there's some level of uncomfortability, if that's a word, but I get very uncomfortable just trying to learn all that stuff and trying to sort of get my head around it because it's not my background, right? I'm like the traditional router guy, like let's build the routes, let's do all this stuff. Let's not, the whole concept of like service discovery and service meshes, like I get it at the surface, but when you peel back the onion, you realize just how complex it is. And when you don't have 20 years of experience doing it, it's very daunting, right? So I think to answer your direct question, that is the future. 20 years from now, I think networking, there'll be a lot more managed services in play that is obfuscating or, managing a lot of the networking. And the network engineer 20 years from now will probably be very different than like the network engineer who works in the industry today. So if you're a young network engineer and you're just getting started, like you want to start digesting all of that stuff because that's going to be very commonplace in 10 years. Hopefully at that point, maybe I'm retired and I don't have to worry about it. But that is where things are going, right? Like this is the whole point of having these conversations. 3 years ago, I wasn't having these conversations. Now, more and more of the conversations are like, the service-oriented construct and what is Google offering here? What is Google's vision of the future? And it really is all of these sort of things. Is traditional networking ever going to completely go away? Absolutely not, right? Like it's always going to be there. Routers still exist and routes still exist to move bits and bytes back and forth, right? It's just a matter of like how they're built and sort of the constructs that we're using over the top that I think change, and you start to be less focused on the network and start focusing more on the services themselves.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, Ryan, for covering this somewhat less talked about topic. You have an important job in the coming years to help customers move to and adopt a service-oriented model in the cloud, at least before you retire. And at the same time, you want to be able to support more of a traditional network-oriented model, whether it's lift and shift or conversion into the cloud. So I just want to thank you again for being on the show, and thank everybody else for joining and for tuning in.
Yeah, and I'd love for people that are watching this, was this interesting to hear for us to talk about? What are some other topics you'd like to see us talk about? I have things I think are great and interesting, but I'd love to hear from people that are out there in the world, and happy to look at your comments and brainstorm around how we can deliver some more content to you.
Yeah, exactly. So if there's anything we covered today that was of interest, or we didn't get to a question that you might have about this topic, please comment below. We are actually going to read all of them and respond to all of your comments. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and check out our next episodes coming out. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks.